You're listening to Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Covencast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovencast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 5, Subsection 4, The Magical Control of the Wind. Once more, the savage thinks he can make the wind to blow or to be still. When the day is hot, and a yakut has a long way to go, he takes a stone which he has chanced to find in an animal or fish, winds a horsehair several times round it, and ties it to a stick. He then waves the stick about, uttering a spell. Soon a cool breeze begins to blow. In order to procure a cool wind for 9 days, the stone should first be dipped in the blood of a bird or beast, and then presented to the sun, while the sorcerer makes 3 turns contrary to the course of the luminary. If a Hottentot desires the wind to drop, he takes one of his fattest skins and hangs it on the end of a pole, in the belief that by blowing the skin down the wind will lose all its force and must itself fall. Fuegian wizards throw shells against the wind to make it drop. The natives of the island of Babili of New Guinea are reputed to make wind by blowing with their mouths. In stormy weather, the Bokajum people say the Babili folk are at it again, blowing away. Another way of making wind which is practiced in New Guinea is to strike a windstone lightly with a stick. To strike it hard would bring on a hurricane. So in Scotland, witches used to raise the wind by dipping a rag in water and beating it thrice on a stone, saying, "I knock this rag upon this stane, to raise the wind in the devil's name. It shall not lie till I please again." In Greenland, a woman in childbed and for some time after delivery is supposed to possess the power of laying a storm. She has only to go out of doors, fill her mouth with air, and coming back into the house, blow it out again. In antiquity, there was a family in Corinth which enjoyed the reputation of being able to still the raging wind, but we do not know in what manner its members exercised a useful function, which probably earned for them a more solid recompense than mere repute among the seafaring population of the isthmus. Even in Christian times, under the reign of Constantine, a certain Sopater suffered death at Constantinople on a charge of binding the winds by magic, because it happened that the corn ships of Egypt and Syria were detained afar off by calms or headwinds. To the rage and disappointment of the hungry Byzantine rabble, Finnish wizards used to sell wind to storm-stayed mariners. The wind was enclosed in 3 knots. If they undid the first knot, a moderate wind sprang up. If the second, it blew half a gale. If the third, a hurricane. Indeed, the Estonians, whose country is divided from Finland only by an arm of the sea, still believe in the magical powers of their northern neighbors. The bitter winds that blow in spring from the north and northeast, bringing ague and rheumatic inflammations in their train, are set down by the simple Estonian peasantry to the machinations of the Finnish wizards and witches. In particular, they regard with special dread 3 days in spring, which they gave the name Days of the Cross. One of them falls on the eve of Ascension Day. The people in the neighborhood of Fellin fear to go out on these days, lest the cruel winds from Lapland should smite them dead. A popular Estonian song runs, "Wind of the cross, rushing and mighty, heavy the blow of thy wings sweeping past, wild wailing wind of misfortune and sorrow, wizards of Finland ride by on the blast." It is said, too, that sailors, beating up against the wind in the Gulf of Finland, sometimes see a strange sail heave in sight astern and overhaul them, hand over hand. On she comes with a cloud of canvas, all her studding sails out, right in the teeth of the wind, forging her way through the foaming billows, dashing back the spray in sheets from her cutwater, every sail swollen to bursting, every rope strained and cracking. Then the sailors know that she hails from Finland. The art of tying up the wind in 3 knots, so that the more knots are loosed, the stronger will blow the wind, has been attributed to wizards in Lapland and to witches in Shetland, Lewis, and the Isle of Man. Shetland seamen still buy winds in the shape of knotted handkerchiefs or threads from old women who claim to rule the storms. There are said to be ancient crones in Lerwick, now who live by selling wind. Ulysses received the wind in leathern bag from Aeolus, king of the winds. The Matu-Matu in New Guinea think that storms are sent by an Oyabu sorcerer. For each wind he has a bamboo, which he opens at pleasure. On the top of Mount Agu in Togo, a district of West Africa, resides a fetish called Bagba, who is supposed to control the wind and the rain. His priest is said to keep the winds shut up in great pots. Often the stormy wind is regarded as an evil being who may be intimidated, driven away, or killed. When storms and bad weather have lasted long, and food is scarce with the central Eskimo, they endeavor to conjure the tempest by making a long whip of seaweed, armed with which they go down to the beach and strike out in the direction of the wind, crying, "Taba! It is enough!" Once when northwesterly winds had kept the ice long on the coast and food was becoming scarce, the Eskimo performed a ceremony to make it calm. A fire was kindled on the shore, and the men gathered round it and chanted. An old man then stepped up to the fire, and in coaxing voice invited the demon of the wind to come under the fire and warm itself. When he was supposed to have arrived, a vessel of water, to which each man present had contributed, was thrown on the flames by an old man, and immediately a flight of arrows sped towards the spot where the fire had been. They thought that the demon would not stay where he had been so badly treated. To complete the effect, guns were discharged in various directions, and the captain of a European vessel was invited to fire on the wind with cannon. On the 21st of February, 1883, a similar ceremony was performed by the Eskimo of Point Barrow, Alaska, with the intention of killing the spirit of the wind. Women drove the demon from their houses with clubs and knives, with which they made passes in the air, and the men, gathering round a fire, shot him with their rifles and crushed him under a heavy stone the moment that steam rose in a cloud from the smoldering embers on which a tub of water had just been thrown. The Lengua Indians of the Grand Chaco ascribe the rush of a whirlwind to the passage of a spirit, and they fling sticks at it to frighten it away. When the wind blows down their huts, the Payaguas of South America snatch up firebrands and run against the wind, menacing it with the blazing brands, while others beat the air with their fists to frighten the storm. When the Guaycuras were threatened by a severe storm, the men go out armed, and the women and children scream their loudest to intimidate the demon. During a tempest, the inhabitants of a Batak village in Sumatra have been seen to rush from their houses armed with sword and lance. The Rajah placed himself at their head, and with shouts and yells they hewed and hacked at the invisible foe. An old woman was observed to be especially active in the defense of her house, slashing the air right and left with a long saber. In a violent thunderstorm, the peals sounding very near, the Kayans of Borneo have been seen to draw their swords threateningly, half out of their scabbards, as if to frighten away the demons of the storm. In Australia, the huge columns of red sand that move rapidly across a desert tract are thought by the natives to be spirits passing along. Once an athletic young black ran after one of these moving columns to kill it with boomerangs. He was away 2 or 3 hours and came back very weary, saying he had killed Ku-Chi, the demon, but that Ku-Chi had growled at him, and he must die. Of the Bedouins of eastern Africa, it is said that no whirlwind ever sweeps across the path without being pursued by a dozen savages with drawn creeses, who stab into the center of the dusty column in order to drive away the evil spirit that is believed to be riding on the blast. In the light of these examples, a story told by Herodotus, which his modern critics have treated as fable, is perfectly credible. He says, without however vouching for the truth of the tale, that once in the land of the Sili, the modern Tripoli, the wind blowing from the Sahara had dried up all the water tanks, so the people took counsel and marched in a body to make war on the south wind. But when they entered the desert, the simoons swept down on them and buried them to a man. The story may well have been told by one who watched them disappearing in battle array with drums and cymbals beating into the red cloud of whirling sand. Chapter 6. Magicians as Kings. The foregoing evidence may satisfy us that in many lands and many races, magic has claimed to control the great forces of nature for the good of man. If that has been so, the practitioners of the art must necessarily be personages of importance and influence in any society which puts faith in their extravagant pretensions, and it would be no matter for surprise if, by virtue of the reputation which they enjoy and of the awe which they inspire, some of them should attain to the highest position of authority over their credulous fellows. In point of fact, magicians appear to have often developed into chiefs and kings. Let us begin by looking at the lowest race of men as to whom we possess comparatively full and accurate information, the aborigines of Australia. These savages are ruled neither by chiefs nor kings. So far as their tribes can be said to have a political constitution, it is a democracy, or rather an oligarchy, of old and influential men, who meet in council and decide on all measures of importance, to the practical exclusion of the younger men. Their deliberative assembly answers to the Senate of later times. If we had to coin a word for such a government of elders, we might call it a genotocracy. The elders, who in aboriginal Australia thus meet and direct the affairs of their tribe, appear to be for the most part the headmen of their respective totem clans. Now in Central Australia, where the desert nature of the country and the almost complete isolation from foreign influences have retarded progress and preserved the natives on the whole in their most primitive state, the headmen of the various totem clans are charged with the important task of performing magical ceremonies for the multiplication of the totems, and as the great majority of the totems are edible animals or plants, it follows that these men are commonly expected to provide the people with food by means of magic. Others have to make the rain to fall, or to render other services to the community. In short, among the tribes of Central Australia, the headmen are public magicians. Further, their most important function is to take charge of the sacred storehouse, usually a cleft in the rocks or a hole in the ground where are kept the holy stones and sticks, chiringa, with which the souls of all the people, both living and dead, are apparently supposed to be in a manner bound up. Thus, while the headmen have certainly to perform what we should call civil duties, such as to inflict punishment for breaches of tribal custom, their principal functions are sacred or magical. When we pass from Australia to New Guinea, we find that, though the natives stand at a far higher level of culture than the Australian Aborigines, the constitution of society among them is still essentially democratic or oligarchic, and chieftainship exists only in embryo. Thus, Sir William McGregor tells us that in British New Guinea, no one has ever arisen wise enough, bold enough, and strong enough to become the despot even of a single district. The nearest approach to this has been the very distant one of some person becoming a renowned wizard, but that has only resulted in levying a certain amount of blackmail. According to a native account, the origin of the power of Melanesian chiefs lies entirely in the belief that they have communication with mighty ghosts, and wield that supernatural power whereby they can bring the influence of the ghosts to bear. If a chief imposed a fine, it was paid because the people universally dreaded his ghostly power, and firmly believed that he could inflict calamity and sickness upon such as resisted him. As soon as any considerable number of his people began to disbelieve in his influence with the ghosts, his power to levy fines was shaken. Again, Dr. George Brown tells us that in New Britain, a ruling chief was always supposed to exercise priestly functions. That is, he professed to be in constant communication with the Tabarans, spirits, and through their influence he was enabled to bring rain or sunshine, fair winds or foul ones, sickness or health, success or disaster in war, and generally to procure any blessings or curse from which the applicant was willing to pay a sufficient price. Still rising in the scale of culture, we come to Africa, where both the chieftainship and the kingship are fully developed, and here the evidence for the evolution of the chief out of the magician, and especially out of the rainmaker, is comparatively plentiful. Thus, among the Wambagwe, a Bantu people of East Africa, the original form of government was a family republic, but the enormous power of the sorcerers, transmitted by inheritance, soon raised them to the rank of petty lords or chiefs. Of the 3 chiefs living in the country in 1894, 2 were much dreaded as magicians, and the wealth of the cattle they possessed came to them almost wholly in the shape of presents bestowed for their services in that capacity. Their principal art was that of rainmaking. The chiefs of the Watataru, another people of East Africa, are said to be nothing but sorcerers destitute of any direct political influence. Again, among the Wagogo of East Africa, the main power of the chiefs, we are told, is derived from their art of rainmaking. If the chief cannot make rain himself, he must procure it from someone who can. Again, among the tribes of the Upper Nile, the medicine men were generally the chiefs. Their authority rests above all upon their supposed power of making rain, for rain is the one thing which matters to the people in those districts, as if it does not come down at the right time, it means untold hardships for the community. It is, therefore, small wonder that men more cunning than their fellows should arrogate to themselves the power of producing it, or that having gained such a reputation, they should trade on the credulity of their simpler neighbors. Hence, most of the chiefs of these tribes are rainmakers, and enjoy a popularity in proportion to their powers to give rain to their people at the proper season. Rainmaking chiefs always build their villages on the slopes of a fairly high hill, so they no doubt know that the hills attract the clouds, and that they are, therefore, fairly safe in their weather forecasts. Each of these rainmakers has a number of rainstones, such as rock crystal, aventurine, and amethyst, which he keeps in a pot. When he wishes to produce rain, he plunges the stones in water, and taking in his hand a peeled cane, which is spit at the top, he beckons with it to the clouds to come, or waves them away in the way they should go, muttering an incantation the while. Or he pours water and the entrails of a sheep or goat into a hollow in a stone, and then sprinkles the water towards the sky. Though the chief acquires wealth by the exercise of his supposed magical powers, he often, perhaps generally, comes to a violent end, for in time of drought the angry people assemble and kill him, believing it is he who prevents the rain from falling. Yet the office is usually hereditary, and passes from father to son. Among the tribes which cherish these beliefs and observe these customs are the Latuka, Bari, Laluba, and Lukoya. In Central Africa, again, the Lendu tribe, to the west of Lake Albert, firmly believe that certain people possess the power of making rain. Among them, the rainmaker either is a chief or almost invariably becomes one. The Banyoro also have a great respect for the dispensers of rain, whom they load with a profusion of gifts. The great dispenser, who has absolute and uncontrollable power over the rain, is the king, but he can depute his power to other persons, so that the benefit may be distributed, and the heavenly water laid on over the various parts of the kingdom. In Western, as well as in Eastern and Central Africa, we meet with the same union of chiefly and magical functions. Thus, in the Fan tribe, the strict distinction between chief and medicine man does not exist. The chief is also a medicine man, and a smith to boot. For the Fans esteem the smith's craft sacred, and none but chiefs may meddle with it. As to the relation between the offices of chief and rainmaker in South Africa, a well-informed writer observes, in very old days the chief was the great rainmaker of the tribe. Some chiefs allowed no one else to compete with them, lest a successful rainmaker should be chosen as chief. There was also another reason. The rainmaker was sure to become a rich man if he gained a great reputation, and it would manifestly never do for the chief to allow any one to be too rich. The rainmaker exerts tremendous control over the people, and so it would be most important to keep this function connected with royalty. Tradition always places the power of making rain as the fundamental glory of ancient chiefs and heroes, and it seems probable that it may have been the origin of chieftainship. The man who made the rain would naturally become the chief. In the same way, Chaka, the famous Zulu despot, used to declare that he was the only diviner in the country, for if he allowed rivals, his life would be insecure. Similarly speaking of the South African tribes in general, Dr. Moffat says that the rainmaker is in the estimation of the people no mean personage, possessing an influence over the minds of the people superior even to that of the king, who is likewise compelled to yield to the dictates of his arch-official. The foregoing evidence renders it probable that in Africa the king has often been developed out of the public magician, and especially out of the rainmaker. The unbounded fear which the magician inspires, and the wealth which he amasses in the exercise of his profession, may both be supposed to have contributed to his promotion. But if the career of a magician, and especially of a rainmaker, offers great rewards to the successful practitioner of the art, it is beset with many pitfalls into which the unskilful or unlucky artist may fall. The position of the public sorcerer is indeed a very precarious one, for where the people firmly believe that he has it in his power to make the rain to fall, the sun to shine, and the fruits of the earth to grow, they naturally impute drought and dearth to his culpable negligence or willful obstinacy, and they punish him accordingly. Hence, in Africa, the chief who fails to procure rain is often exiled or killed. Thus, in some parts of West Africa, when prayers and offerings presented to the king have failed to procure rain, his subjects bind him with ropes and take him by force to the grave of his forefathers, that he may obtain from them the needed rain. The Benhars in West Africa ascribe to their king the power of causing rain or fine weather. So long as the weather is fine, they load him with presents of grain and cattle. But if long drought or rain threatens to spoil the crops, they insult and beat him till the weather changes. When the harvest fails, or the surf on the coast is too heavy to allow of fishing, the people of Luango accuse their king of a bad heart and depose him. On the grain coast, the high priest or fetish king, who bears the title of Bough, is responsible for the health of the community, the fertility of the earth, and the abundance of fish in the sea and rivers. And if the country suffers in any of these respects, the Bough is disposed from his office. In Usukuma, a great district on the southern bank of the Victoria Nyanza, the rain and locust question is part and parcel of the Sultan's government. He too must know how to make rain and drive away the locusts. If he and his medicine men are unable to accomplish this, his whole existence is at stake in times of distress. On a certain occasion, when the rain so greatly desired by the people did not come, the Sultan was simply driven out, in Ututwa, near Nassa. The people, in fact, hold that rulers must have power over nature and her phenomena. Again, we are told of the natives of the Nyanza region generally that they are persuaded that rain only falls as a result of magic, and the important duty of causing it to descend devolves on the chief of the tribe. If rain does not come at the proper time, everybody complains. More than one petty king has been banished from his country because of drought. Among the Lutuka of the Upper Nile, when the crops are withering and all the efforts of the chief to draw down rain have proved fruitless, the people commonly attack him by night, rob him of all he possesses, and drive him away, but often they kill him. In many other parts of the world, kings have been expected to regulate the course of nature for the good of their people, and have been punished if they fail to do so. It appears that the Scythians, when food was scarce, used to put their king in bonds. In ancient Egypt, the sacred kings were blamed for the failure of the crops, but the sacred beasts were also held responsible for the course of nature. When pestilence and other calamities had fallen on the land in consequence of a long and severe drought, the priests took the animals by night and threatened them. But if the evil did not abate, they slew the beasts. On the coral island of Niue, or Savage Island, in the South Pacific, there formerly reigned a line of kings. But as the kings were also high priests and were supposed to make the food grow, the people became angry with them in times of scarcity and killed them, till at last, as one after another was killed, no one would be king, and the monarchy came to an end. Ancient Chinese writers inform us that in Korea the blame was laid on the king whenever too much or too little rain fell and the crops did not ripen. Some said that he must be deposed, others that he must be slain. Among the American Indians, the furthest advance towards civilization was made under the monarchical and theocratic governments of Mexico and Peru. But we know too little of the early history of these countries to say whether the predecessors of their defied kings were medicine men or not. Perhaps a trace of such a succession may be detected in the oath which the Mexican kings, when they mounted the throne, swore that they would make the sun to shine, the clouds to give rain, the rivers to flow, and the earth to bring forth fruits in abundance. Certainly, in aboriginal America, the sorcerer or medicine man, surrounded by a halo of mystery and an atmosphere of awe, was a personage of great influence and importance, and he may well have developed into a chief or king in many tribes. Though positive evidence of such a development appears to be lacking, Thus Catlin tells us that in North America the medicine men are valued as dignitaries in the tribe, and the greatest respect is paid to them by the whole community, not only for their skill in their materia medica, but more especially for their tact in magic and mysteries, in which they all deal to a very great extent. In all tribes their doctors are conjurers, are magicians, are soothsayers, and I had like to have said high priests, inasmuch as they superintend and conduct all their religious ceremonies. They are looked upon by all as oracles of the nation. In all councils of war and peace they have a seat with the chiefs, and are regularly consulted before any public step is taken, and the greatest deference and respect is paid to their opinions. Similarly, in California, the shaman was, and still is perhaps, the most important individual among the Maidu. In the absence of any definite system of government, the word of a shaman has great weight. As a class, they are regarded with much awe, and as a rule, are obeyed much more than the chief. In South America also, the magicians or medicine men seem to have been on the high road to chieftainship or kingship. One of the earliest settlers on the coast of Brazil, the Frenchman, Thevet, reports that the Indians hold these pages, or medicine men, in such honor and reverence that they adore or rather idolize them. You may see the common folk go to meet them, prostrate themselves, and pray to them, saying, "Grant that I be not ill, and I do not die, neither I nor my children," or some such request, and he answers, "You shall not die, you shall not be ill," and such like replies. But sometimes, if it happens that these pages do not tell the truth, and things turn out otherwise than they predicted, the people make no scruple of killing them as unworthy of the title and dignity of pages. Among the Lingua Indians of the Gran Chaco, every clan has its cacique or chief, but he possesses little authority. In virtue of his office, he has to make many presents, so he seldom grows rich and is generally more shabbily clad than any of his subjects. As a matter of fact, the magician is the man who has most power in his hands, and he is accustomed to receive presents instead of to give them. It is the magician's duty to bring down misfortune and plagues on the enemies of his tribe, and to guard his own people against hostile magic. For these services he is well paid, and by them he acquires a position of great influence and authority. Throughout the Malay region, the Raja or king is commonly regarded with superstitious veneration as the possessor of supernatural powers, and there are grounds for thinking that he too, like apparently so many African chiefs, has been developed out of a simple magician. At the present day, the Malays firmly believe that the king possesses a personal influence over the works of nature, such as the growth of crops and the bearing of fruit trees. The same prolific virtue is supposed to reside, though in a lesser degree, in his delegates, and even in the persons of Europeans who chance to have charge of their districts. Thus in Selangor, one of the native states of the Malay Peninsula, the success or failure of the rice crops is often attributed to the change of district officers. The Turateyas of southern Celebes hold that the prosperity of the rice depends on the behavior of their princes, and that bad government, by which they mean a government which does not conform to ancient custom, will result in a failure of the crops. The Dyaks of Sarawak believed that their famous English ruler, Raja Brooke, was endowed with a certain magical virtue which, if properly applied, could render the rice crops abundant. Hence, when he visited a tribe, they used to bring him the seed which they intended to sow next year, and he fertilized it by shaking over it the women's necklaces, which had been previously dipped in a special mixture. And when he entered a village, the women would wash and bathe his feet first with water, and then with milk of a young coconut, and lastly with water again. And all this water which had touched his person they preserved for the purpose of distributing it on their farms, believing that it ensured an abundant harvest. Tribes which were too far off for him to visit used to send him a small piece of white cloth and a little gold or silver, and when these things had been impregnated by his generative virtue, they buried them in their fields and confidently expected a heavy crop. Once, when a European remarked that the rice crops of the Samban tribe were thin, the chief immediately replied that they could not be otherwise, since Raja Brooke had never visited them, and he begged that Mr. Brooke might be induced to visit his tribe and remove the sterility of their land. The belief that kings possess magical or supernatural powers by virtue of which they can fertilize the earth and confer other benefits on their subjects would seem to have been shared by the ancestors of all the Aryan races from India to Ireland, and it has left clear traces of itself in our own country down to modern times. Thus, the ancient Hindu law book, called the Laws of Manu, describes as follows the effects of the good king's reign. In that country where the king avoids taking the property of mortal sinners, men are born in due time and are long-lived, and the crops of the husbandman spring up each as it was sown, and the children die not, and no misshaped offspring is born. In Homeric Greece, kings and chiefs were spoken of as sacred or divine. Their houses, too, were divine, and their chariots sacred. And it was thought that the reign of a good king caused the black earth to bring forth wheat and barley, the trees to be loaded with fruit, the flocks to multiply, and the sea to yield fish. In the Middle Ages, when Waldemar I, king of Denmark, traveled in Germany, mothers brought their infants and husbandmen their seed for him to lay his hands on, thinking that children would both thrive the better for the royal touch. And for a like reason, farmers asked him to throw the seed for them. It was the belief of the ancient Irish that when their kings observed the customs of their ancestors, the seasons were mild, the crops plentiful, the cattle fruitful, the waters abounded with fish, and the fruit trees had to be propped up on account of the weight of their produce. A canon attributed to St. Patrick enumerates among the blessings that attend the reign of the just king fine weather, calm seas, crops abundant, and trees laden with fruit. On the other hand, dearth, dryness of cows, blight of fruit, and scarcity of corn were regarded as infallible proofs that the reigning king was bad. Perhaps the last relic of such superstitions which lingered about our English kings was the notion that they could heal scrofula by their touch. The disease was accordingly known as the king's evil. Queen Elizabeth often exercised this miraculous gift of healing. On Midsummer Day, 1633, Charles I cured 100 patients at one swoop in the Chapel Royal at Holyrood. But it was under his son, Charles II, that the practice seems to have attained its highest vogue. It is said that in the course of his reign, Charles II touched near 100,000 persons for scrofula. The press to get near him was sometimes terrific. On one occasion, 6 or 7 of those who came to be healed were trampled to death. The cool-headed William III contemptuously refused to lend himself to the hocus-pocus, and when his palace was besieged by the usual unsavory crowd, he ordered them to be turned away with a dole. On the only occasion when he was importuned into laying his hand on a patient, he said to him, "God give you better health and more sense." However, the practice was continued, as might have been expected, by the dull bigot James II and his dull daughter, Queen Anne. The kings of France also claimed to possess some gift of healing by touch, which they said to have derived from Clovis, or from St. Louis, while our English kings inherited it from Edward the Confessor. Similarly, the savage chiefs of Tonga were believed to heal scrofula, and cases of indurated liver by the touch of their feet, and the cure was strictly homeopathic, for the disease as well as the cure was thought to be caused by contact with the royal person or with anything that belonged to it. On the whole, then, we seem to be justified in inferring that in many parts of the world the king is the lineal successor of the old magician or medicine men. When once a special class of sorcerers has been segregated from the community and entrusted by it with the discharge of duties on which the public safety and welfare are believed to depend, these men gradually rise to wealth and power, till their leaders blossom out into sacred kings. But the great social revolution, which thus begins with democracy and ends in despotism, is attended by an intellectual revolution which affects both the conception and the functions of royalty. For as time goes on, the fallacy of magic becomes more and more apparent to the acuter minds, and is slowly displaced by religion. In other words, the magician gives way to the priest, who, renouncing the attempt to control directly the processes of nature for the good of man, seeks to attain the same end indirectly by appealing to the gods to do for him what he no longer fancies he can do for himself. Hence the king, starting as a magician, tends gradually to exchange the practice of magic for the priestly function of prayer and sacrifice. And while the distinction between the human and the divine is still imperfectly drawn, it is often imagined that men may themselves attain to Godhead, not merely after their death, but in their lifetime, through the temporary or permanent possession of their whole nature by a great and powerful spirit. No class of the community has benefited so much as kings by this belief in the possible incarnation of a god in human form, the doctrine of that incarnation, and with it the theory of the divinity of kings in the strict sense of the word, will form the subject of the following chapter. Chapter 7. Incarnate Human Gods. The instances which in the preceding chapters I have drawn from the beliefs and practices of rude peoples all over the world may suffice to prove that the savage fails to recognize those limitations to his power over nature which seem so obvious to us. In a society where every man is supposed to be endowed, more or less, with powers which we should call supernatural, it is plain that the distinction between gods and men is somewhat blurred, or rather has scarcely emerged. The conception of gods as superhuman beings, endowed with powers to which man possesses nothing comparable in degree, and hardly even in kind, has been slowly evolved in the course of history. By primitive peoples, the supernatural agents are not regarded as greatly, if at all, superior to man, for they may be frightened and coerced by him into doing his will. At this stage of thought, the world is viewed as a great democracy. All beings in it, whether natural or supernatural, are supposed to stand on a footing of tolerable equality. But with the growth of his knowledge, man learns to realize more clearly the vastness of nature, and his own littleness and feebleness in presence of it. The recognition of his helplessness does not, however, carry with it a corresponding belief in the impotence of those supernatural beings with which his imagination peoples the universe. On the contrary, it enhances his conception of their power. For the idea of the world as a system of impersonal forces acting in accordance with the fixed and invariable laws has not yet fully dawned or darkened upon him. The germ of the idea he certainly has, and he acts upon it, not only in magic art, but in much of the business of daily life. But the idea remains undeveloped, and so far as he attempts to explain the world he lives in, he pictures it as the manifestation of conscious will and personal agency. If then he feels himself to be so frail and slight, how vast and powerful must he deem the beings who control the gigantic machinery of nature? Thus, as his old sense of equality with the gods slowly vanishes, he resigns at the same time the hope of directing the course of nature by his own unaided resources, that is, by magic, and looks more and more to the gods as the sole repositories of those supernatural powers which he once claimed to share with them. With the advance of knowledge, therefore, prayer and sacrifice assume the leading place in religious ritual, and magic, which once ranked with them as a legitimate equal, is gradually relegated to the background and sinks to the level of a black art. It is now regarded as an encroachment, at once vain and impious, on the domain of the gods, and as such encounters the steady opposition of the priests, whose reputation and influence rise or fall with those of their gods. Hence, when at a late period the distinction between religion and superstition has emerged, we find that sacrifice and prayer are the resource of the pious and enlightened portion of the community, while magic is the refuge of the superstitious and ignorant. But when, still later, the conception of the elemental forces as personal agents is giving way to the recognition of natural law, then magic, based as it implicitly is on the idea of a necessary and invariable sequence of cause and effect, independent of personal will, reappears from the obscurity and discredit into which it had fallen, and by investigating the casual sequences in nature, directly prepares the way for science. Alchemy leads up to chemistry. The notion of a man-god or a human being endowed with divine or supernatural powers belongs essentially to that earlier period of religious history, in which gods and men are still viewed as beings of much the same order, and before they are divided by the impassable gulf which, to later thought, opens out between them. Strange, therefore, as may seem to us the idea of a god incarnate in human form, it was nothing very startling for early man, who sees in a man-god or a god-man only a higher degree of the same supernatural powers which he arrogates in perfect good faith to himself. nor does he draw any very sharp distinction between a god and a powerful sorcerer. His gods are often merely invisible magicians who, behind the veil of nature, work the same sort of charms and incantations which the human magician works in a visible and bodily form among his fellows. And as the gods are commonly believed to exhibit themselves in the likeness of men to their worshippers, it is easy for the magician and his supposed miraculous powers to acquire the reputation of being an incarnate deity. Thus, beginning as little more than a simple conjurer, the medicine man or the magician tends to blossom out into a full-blown god and king in one. Only in speaking of him as a god we must beware of importing into the savage conception of deity those very abstract and complex ideas which we attach to the term. Our ideas on this profound subject are the fruit of a long intellectual and moral evolution, and they are so far from being shared by the savage that he cannot even understand them when they are explained to him. Much of the controversy which has raged as to the religion of the lower races has sprung merely from a mutual understanding. The savage does not understand the thoughts of the civilized man. The few civilized men understand the thoughts of the savage. When the savage uses his word for God, he has in his mind a being of a certain sort. When the civilized man uses his word for God, he has in his mind a being of a very different sort, and if, as commonly happens, the two men are equally unable to place themselves at the other's point of view, nothing but confusion and mistakes can result from their discussions. If we civilized men insist on limiting the name of God to that particular conception of the divine nature which we ourselves have formed, then we must confess that the savage has no God at all. But we shall adhere more closely to the facts of history, if we allow most of the higher savages, at least, to possess a rudimentary notion of certain supernatural beings, who may fittingly be called gods, though not in the full sense in which we use the word. That rudimentary notion represents, in all probability, the germ out of which the civilized peoples have gradually evolved their own high conceptions of deity. And if we could trace the whole course of religious development, we might find that the chain which links our idea of the Godhead with that of the savage is one and unbroken. With these explanations and cautions, I will now adduce some examples of gods who have been believed by their worshippers to be incarnate in living human beings, whether men or women. The persons in whom a deity is thought to reveal himself are by no means always kings or descendants of kings. The supposed incarnation may take place even in men of the humblest rank. In India, for example, one human god started in life as a cotton bleacher, and another as the son of a carpenter. I shall, therefore, not draw my examples exclusively from royal personages, as I wish to illustrate the general principle of the deification of living men, in other words, the incarnation of a deity in human form. Such incarnate gods are common in rude society. The incarnation may be temporary or permanent. In the former case, the incarnation, commonly known as inspiration or possession, reveals itself in supernatural knowledge rather than in supernatural power. In other words, its useful manifestations are divination and prophecy rather than miracles. On the other hand, when the incarnation is not merely temporary, when the divine spirit has permanently taken up its abode in a human body, the God-man is usually expected to vindicate his character by working miracles. Only we have to remember that by men at this stage of thought, miracles are not considered as breaches of natural law. Not conceiving the existence of natural law, primitive man cannot conceive a breach of it. A miracle is to him merely an unusually striking manifestation of a common power. The belief in temporary incarnation, or inspiration, is worldwide. Certain persons are supposed to be possessed from time to time by a spirit or deity. While the possession lasts, their own personality lies in abeyance. The presence of the spirit is revealed by convulsive shiverings and shakings of the man's whole body, by wild gestures and excited looks, all of which are referred not to the man himself, but to the spirit, which has entered into him, and in this abnormal state all his utterances are accepted as the voice of the god or spirit dwelling in him and speaking through him. Thus, for example, in the Sandwich Islands, the king, personating the god, uttered the responses of the oracle from his concealment in a frame of wickerwork. But in the southern island of the Pacific, the god frequently entered the priest, who inflated, as it were, with the divinity, ceased to act or speak as a voluntary agent, but moved and spoke as entirely under supernatural influence. In this respect, there was a striking resemblance between the rude oracles of the Polynesians and those of the celebrated nations of ancient Greece. As soon as the god was supposed to have entered the priest, the latter became violently agitated, and worked himself up to the highest pitch of apparent frenzy. The muscles of the limbs seemed convulsed, the body swelled, the countenance became terrific, the features distorted, and the eyes wild and strained. In this state he often rolled on the earth, foaming at the mouth, as if laboring under the influence of the divinity by whom he was possessed, and, in shrill cries, and violent and often indistinct sounds, revealed the will of the god. The priests, who were attending and versed in the mysteries, received and reported to the people the declarations which had been thus received. When the priest had uttered the response of the oracle, the violent paroxysm gradually subsided, and comparative composure ensued. The god did not, however, always leave him as soon as the communication had been made. Sometimes the same Torah or priest continued for 2 or 3 days, possessed by the spirit or deity. A piece of a native cloth of a peculiar kind, worn round one arm, was an indication of inspiration, or of the indwelling of the god with the individual who wore it. The acts of the man during this period were considered as those of the god, and hence the greatest attention was paid to his expressions and the whole of his deportment. When Uriah, under the inspiration of the spirit, the priest was always considered as sacred as the god, and was called during this period Etua, God, though at other times only denominated Torah, or priest. But examples of such temporary inspiration are so common in every part of the world, and are now so familiar through books on ethnology, that it is needless to multiply illustrations of the general principle. It may be well, however, to refer to 2 particular modes of producing temporary inspiration, because they are perhaps less known than some others, and because we shall have occasion to refer to them later on. One of these modes of producing inspiration is by sucking the fresh blood of a sacrificed victim. In the temple of Apollo Diridiades at Argos, a lamb was sacrificed by night once a month. A woman, who had to observe a rule of chastity, tasted the blood of the lamb, and thus, being inspired by the god, she prophesied or divined. At Agira in Achaia, the priestess of earth drank the fresh blood of a bull before she descended into the cave to prophesy. Similarly, among the Kuruvakarans, a class of bird catchers and beggars in southern India, the goddess Kali is believed to descend upon the priest, and he gives oracular replies after sucking the blood which streams from the cut throat of a goat. At a festival of the Alfoors of Manassa in northern Celebes, after a pig has been killed, the priest rushes furiously at it, thrusts his head into the carcass, and drinks of the blood. Then he is dragged away from it by force and set on a chair, whereupon he begins to prophesy how the rice crop will turn out that year. A second time he runs at the carcass and drinks of the blood. A second time he is forced into the chair and continues his predictions. It is thought that there is a spirit in him which possesses the power of prophecy. The other mode of producing temporary inspiration, to which I shall here refer, consists in the use of a sacred tree or plant. Thus, in the Hindu Kush, a fire is kindled with twigs of the sacred cedar, and the Daniel, or Sibyl, with a cloth over her head, inhales the thick pungent smoke till she is seized with convulsions and falls senseless to the ground. Soon she rises and raises a shrill chant, which is caught up and loudly repeated by her audience. So Apollo's prophetess ate the sacred laurel, and was fumigated with it before she prophesied. The Bacchanals ate ivy, and their inspired fury was by some believed to be due to the exciting and intoxicating properties of the plant. In Uganda, the priest, in order to be inspired by his god, smokes a pipe of tobacco, fiercely till he works himself into a frenzy. The loud excited tones in which he then talks are recognized as the voice of the god speaking through him. In Madura, an island off the north coast of Java, each spirit has its regular medium, who is oftener a woman than a man. To prepare herself for the reception of the spirit, she inhales the fumes of incense, sitting with her head over a smoking censer. Gradually she falls into a sort of trance, accompanied by shrieks, grimaces, and violent spasms. The spirit is now supposed to have entered into her, and when she grows calmer, her words are regarded as oracular, being the utterances of the indwelling spirit, while her own soul is temporarily absent. The person temporarily inspired is believed to acquire not merely divine knowledge, but also, at least occasionally, divine power. In Cambodia, when an epidemic breaks out, the inhabitants of several villages unite and go with a band of music at their head to look for the man whom the local god is supposed to have chosen for his temporary incarnation. When found, the man is conducted to the altar of the god, where the mystery of incarnation takes place. Then the man becomes an object of veneration to his fellows, who implore him to protect the village against the plague. A certain image of Apollo, which stood in a sacred cave at Hylay, near Magnesia, was thought to impart superhuman strength. Sacred men, inspired by it, leaped down precipices, tore up huge trees by the roots, and carried them on their backs along the narrowest defiles. The feats performed by inspired dervishes belonged to the same class. Thus far, we have seen that the savage, failing to discern the limits of his ability to control nature, ascribes to himself and to all men certain powers, which we should now call supernatural. Further, we have seen that over and above this general supernaturalism, some persons are supposed to be inspired for short periods by a divine spirit, and thus temporarily to enjoy the knowledge and power of the indwelling deity. From beliefs like these, it is an easy step to the conviction that certain men are permanently possessed by a deity, or in some other undefined way are endued with so high a degree of supernatural power as to be ranked as gods, and to receive the homage of prayer and sacrifice. Sometimes these human gods are restricted to purely supernatural or spiritual functions. Sometimes they exercise supreme political power in addition. In the latter case, they are kings as well as gods, and the government is a theocracy. Thus, in the Marquesas, or Washington Islands, there was a class of men who were deified in their lifetime. They were supposed to wield a supernatural power over the elements. They could give abundant harvests, or smite the ground with barrenness, and they could inflict disease or death. Human sacrifices were offered to them to avert their wrath. There were not many of them, at the most 1 or 2 in each island. They lived in mystic seclusion. Their powers were sometimes, but not always, hereditary. A missionary has described one of these human gods from personal observation. The god was a very old man who lived in a large house within an enclosure. In the house was a kind of altar, and on the beams of the house, and on the trees round it, were hung human skeletons, head down. No one entered the enclosure except the persons dedicated to the service of the god. Only on days when human victims were sacrificed might ordinary people penetrate into the precinct. This human god received more sacrifices than all the other gods. Often he would sit on a sort of scaffold in front of his house and call for 2 or 3 human victims at a time. They were always brought, for the terror he inspired was extreme. He was invoked all over the island, and offerings were sent to him from every side. Again, of the South Sea Islands, in general, we are told that each island had a man who represented or personified the divinity. Such men were called gods, and their substance was confounded with that of the deity. The man-god was sometimes the king himself. Oftener, he was the priest or subordinate chief. The ancient Egyptians, far from restricting their adoration to cats and dogs, and such small deer, very liberally extended it to men. One of these human deities resided at the village of Anabas, and burnt sacrifices were offered to him on the altars, after which, says Porphyry, he would eat his dinner just as if he were an ordinary mortal. In classical antiquity, the Sicilian philosopher Empedocles gave himself out to be not merely a wizard, but a god. Addressing his fellow citizens in verse, he said, "O friends in this great city that climbs the yellow slope of Agrigentum's citadel, who make good works your scope, who offer to the stranger a haven quiet and fair, all hail, among you honored, I walk with lofty air. With garlands blooming, garlands, you crown my noble brow, a mortal man no longer, a deathless godhead now. Wherever I go, the people crowd round and worship pay, and thousands follow seeking to learn the better way. Some crave prophetic visions, some smit with anguish sore, would fain hear words of comfort, and suffer pain no more." He asserted that he could teach his disciples how to make the wind to blow or be still, the rain to fall, and the sun to shine, how to banish sickness and old age, and to raise the dead. When Demetrius Poliorcetes restored the Athenian democracy in 307 BC, the Athenians decreed divine honors to him and his father, Antagonus, both of them being then alive, under the title of the Savior Gods. Altars were set up to the saviors, and a priest appointed to attend to their worship. The people went forth to meet their deliverer with hymns and dances, with garlands and incense and libations. They lined the streets and sang that he was the only true God, for the other gods slept or dwelt far away, or were not, in the words of a contemporary poet, which were chanted in public and sung in private. Of all the gods, the greatest and the dearest to the city are come, for Demeter and Demetrius together time has brought. She comes to hold the maiden's awful rites, and he joyous and fair and laughing, as befits a god, a glorious sight with all his friends about him. He in their midst, they like to stars, and he the sun, son of Poseidon, the mighty Aphrodite's son, all hail. The other gods dwell far away, or have no ears, or are not, or pay us no heed. But thee we present see, no god of wood or stone, but Godhead true, therefore to thee we pray. The ancient Germans believed that there was something holy in women, and accordingly consulted them as oracles. Their sacred women, we are told, looked on the eddying rivers, and listened to the murmur or the roar of the water, and from the sight and sound foretold what would come to pass. But often the veneration of the men went further, and they worshipped women as true and living goddesses. For example, in the reign of Vespasian, a certain Valletta of the tribe of Bructeri was commonly held to be a deity, and in that character reigned over her people, her sway being acknowledged far and wide. She lived in a tower on the river Lippe, a tributary of the Rhine. When the people of Cologne sent to make a treaty with her, the ambassadors were not admitted to her presence. The negotiations were conducted through a minister who acted as the mouthpiece of her divinity and reported her oracular utterances. The example shows how easily, among our rude forefathers, the ideas of divinity and royalty coalesced. It is said that among the Getae, down to the beginning of our era, there was always a man who personified a god, and he was called God by the people. He dwelt on the sacred mountain, and acted as advisor to the king. According to the early Portuguese historian Dos Santos, the Zimbas, or Muzimbas, a people of southeastern Africa, do not adore idols or recognize any god, but instead they venerate and honor their king, whom they regard as a divinity, and they say he is the greatest and best in the world. And the said king says of himself that he alone is God of the earth, for which reason, if it rains, when he does not wish it to do so, or is too hot, he shoots arrows at the sky for not obeying him. The Mashona of southern Africa informed their bishop that they had once had a god, but that the Matabeles had driven him away. This last was in reference to a curious custom in some villages of keeping a man they called their god. He seemed to be consulted by the village and had presents given to him. There was one at a village belonging to a chief Bagonde in the old days. We were asked not to fire off any guns near the village, or we should frighten him away. This Mashona god was formerly bound to render an annual tribute to the king of the Matabele in the shape of 4 black oxen and 1 dance. A missionary has seen and described the deity discharging the latter part of his duty in front of the royal hut. For 3 mortal hours, without a break, to the banging of a tambourine, the click of castanets, and the drone of monotonous song, the swarthy god engaged in a frenzied dance, crouching on his hams like a tailor, sweating like a pig, and bounding about with an agility which testified to the strength and elasticity of his divine legs. The Baganda of Central Africa believed in a god of Lake Nyanza, who sometimes took up his abode in a man or woman. The incarnate god was much feared by all the people, including the king and the chiefs. When the mystery of incarnation had taken place, the man, or rather the god, removed about 1.5 miles from the margin of the lake, and there awaited the appearance of the new moon before he engaged in his sacred duties. From the moment that the crescent moon appeared faintly in the sky, the king and all his subjects were at the command of the divine man. At Luber, God, as he was called, who reigned supreme not only in matters of faith and ritual, but also in questions of war and state policy, he was consulted as an oracle. By his word he could inflict or heal sickness, withhold rain, and cause famine. Large presents were made him when his advice was sought. The chief of Urua, a large region to the west of Lake Tanganyika, arrogates to himself divine honors and power, and pretends to abstain from food for days without feeling its necessity, and indeed declares that as a god he is altogether above requiring food, and only eats, drinks, and smokes for the pleasure it affords him. Among the Galas, when a woman grows tired of the cares of housekeeping, she begins to talk incoherently, and to demean herself extravagantly. This is a sign of the descent of the Holy Spirit, Kalo, upon her. Immediately her husband prostrates himself and adores her. She ceases to bear the humble title of wife and is called Lord. Domestic duties have no further claim on her, and her will is a divine law. The king of Luango is honored by his people, as though he were a god, and he is called Sambi and Pango, which mean God. They believe that he can let them have rain when he likes, and once a year in December, which is the time they want rain, the people come to beg of him to grant it to them. On this occasion, the king, standing on his throne, shoots an arrow into the air, which is supposed to bring on rain. Much the same is said of the king of Mombasa, down to a few years ago, when his spiritual reign on earth was brought to an abrupt end by the carnal weapons of English marines and bluejackets. The king of Benin was the chief object of worship in the dominions. He occupies a higher post here than the Pope does in Catholic Europe, for he is not only God's vicegerent upon earth, but a god himself, whose subjects both obey and adore him as such. Although I believe their adoration to rise rather from fear than love, the king of Ida told the English officers of the Niger expedition, God made me after his own image. I am the same as God, and he appointed me a king. A peculiarly bloodthirsty monarch of Burma, by name Badinsakan, whose very countenance reflected the inbred ferocity of his nature, and under whose reign more victims perished by the executioner than by the common enemy, conceived the notion that he was something more than mortal, and that his high distinction had been granted him as a reward for his numerous good works. Accordingly, he laid aside the title of king, and aimed at making himself a god. With this view, and in imitation of Buddha, who, before being advanced to the rank of a divinity, had quitted his royal palace and seraglio, and retired from the world, Bandinsaken withdrew from his palace to an immense pagoda, the largest in the empire, which he had been engaged in constructing for many years. Here he held conferences with the most learned monks, in which he sought to persuade them that the 5,000 years assigned for the observance of the law of Buddha were now elapsed, and that he himself was the God who was destined to appear after that period, and to abolish the old law by substituting his own. But to his great mortification, many of the monks undertook to demonstrate the contrary, and this disappointment, combined with his love of power and his impatience under the restraints of an ascetic life, quickly disabused him of his imaginary godhead, and drove him back to his palace and his harem. The king of Siam is venerated equally with a divinity. His subjects ought not to look him in the face. They prostrate themselves before him when he passes, and appear before him on their knees, their elbows resting on the ground. There is a special language devoted to his sacred person and attributes, and it must be used by all who speak to or of him. Even the natives have difficulty in mastering this peculiar vocabulary. The hairs of the monarch's head, the soles of his feet, the breadth of his body, indeed every single detail of his person, both outward and inward, have particular names. When he eats or drinks, sleeps or walks, a special word indicates that these acts are being performed by the sovereign, and such words cannot possibly be applied to the acts of any other person whatever. There is no word in the Siamese language by which any creature of higher rank or greater dignity than a monarch can be described, and the missionaries, when they speak of God, are forced to use the native word for king. But perhaps no country in the world has been so prolific of human gods as India. Nowhere has the divine grace been poured out in a more liberal measure on all classes of society, from kings down to milkmen. Thus, amongst the Todas, a pastoral people of the Nilgiri hills of southern India, the dairy is a sanctuary, and the milkman who attends to it has been described as a god. On being asked whether the Todas salute the sun, one of these divine milkmen replied, "Those poor fellows do so, but I," tapping his chest, "I, a god, why should I salute the sun?" Everyone, even his own father, prostrates himself before the milkman, and no one would dare to refuse him anything. No human being except another milkman may touch him, and he gives oracles to all who consult him, speaking with the voice of a god. Further, in India, every king is regarded as little short of a present god. The Hindu law book of Manu goes further and says that even an infant king must not be despised from an idea that he is a mere mortal, for he is a great deity in human form. There is said to have been a sect in Orissa some years ago who worshipped the late Queen Victoria in her lifetime as their chief divinity, and to this day in India, all living persons remarkable for great strength or valor, or for supposed miraculous powers, run the risk of being worshipped as gods. Thus a sect in the Punjab worshipped a deity whom they called Nikal Sen. This Nikal Sen was no other than the redoubted General Nicholson, and nothing that the general could do or say damped the ardor of his adorers. The more he punished them, the greater grew the religious awe with which they worshipped him. At Benares, not many years ago, a celebrated deity was incarnate in the person of a Hindu gentleman who rejoiced in the euphonious name of Swami Bhaskaranandaji Saraswati, and looked uncommonly like the late Cardinal Manning, only more ingenious. His eyes beamed with kindly human interest, and he took what is described as an innocent pleasure in the divine honors paid him by his confiding worshippers. At Chinkvad, a small town about 10 miles from Pune in western India, there lives a family of whom one in each generation is believed by a large proportion of the Marathas to be an incarnation of the elephant-headed god Ganpati. That celebrated deity was first made flesh about the year 1640 in the person of a Brahmin of Pune by name Murabba Gasan, who sought to work out his salvation by abstinence, mortification, and prayer. His piety had its reward. The god himself appeared to him in a vision of the night and promised that a portion of his, that is, of Ganpati's Holy Spirit, should abide with him, and with his seed after him, even to the 7th generation. The divine promise was fulfilled. 7 successive incarnations, transmitted from father to son, manifested the light of Ganpati to a dark world. The last of the direct line, a heavy-looking god with very weak eyes, died in the year 1810. But the cause of truth was too sacred, and the value of the church property too considerable to allow the Brahmins to contemplate the equanimity, the unspeakable loss that would be sustained by a world which knew not Ganpati. Accordingly, they sought and found a holy vessel in whom the divine spirit of the Master had revealed itself anew, and the revelation has been happily continued in an unbroken succession of vessels from that time to this. But a mysterious law of spiritual economy, whose operation in the history of religion we may deplore though we cannot alter, has decreed that the miracles wrought by the God-man in these degenerate days cannot compare with those which were wrought by his predecessors in days gone by, and it is even reported that the only sign vouchsafed by him to the present generation of vipers is the miracle of feeding the multitude, whom he annually entertains to dinner at Chinkvad. A Hindu sect, which has many representatives in Bombay and central India, holds that its spiritual chief, or Maharajas, as they are called, are representatives or even actual incarnations on earth of the god Krishna. And as Krishna looks down from heaven with most favor on such a minister to the wants of his successors and vicars on earth, a peculiar rite called self-devotion has been instituted whereby his faithful worshippers make over their bodies, their souls, and what is perhaps still more important, their worldly substance, to his adorable incarnations. And women are taught to believe that the highest bliss for themselves and their families is to be attained by yielding themselves to the embraces of those beings in whom the divine nature mysteriously coexists with the form and even the appetites of true humanity. Christianity itself has not uniformly escaped the taint of these unhappy delusions. Indeed, it has often been sullied by the extravagances of vain pretenders to a divinity equal or even surpassing that of its great founder. In the 2nd century, Montanus, the Frisian, claimed to be the incarnate Trinity, uniting in his single person God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. Nor is this an isolated case, the exorbitant pretension of a single ill-balanced mind. From the earliest times down to the present day, many sects have believed that Christ, nay God himself, is incarnate in every fully initiated Christian, and they have carried this belief to its logical conclusion by adoring each other. Tertullian records that this was done by his fellow Christians at Carthage in the 2nd century. The disciples of St. Columba worshipped him as an embodiment of Christ. And in the 8th century, Elipandus of Toledo spoke of Christ as a God among gods, meaning that all believers were gods just as truly as Jesus himself. The adoration of each other was customary among the Albigenses, and is noticed hundreds of times in the records of the Inquisition at Toulouse in the early part of the 14th century. In the 13th century, there arose a sect called the Brethren and Sisters of the Free Spirit, who held that by long and assiduous contemplation any man might be united to the deity in an ineffable manner, and become one with the source and parent of all things, and that he who had thus ascended to God and been absorbed in his beatific essence actually formed part of the Godhead, was the Son of God in the same sense and manner with Christ himself, and enjoyed thereby a glorious immunity from the trammels of all laws human and divine. Inwardly transported by his blissful persuasion, though outwardly presenting in their aspect and manners a shocking air of lunacy and distraction, the sectaries roamed from place to place, attired in the most fantastical apparel, and begging their bread with wild shouts and clamour, spurning indignantly every kind of honest labour and industry as an obstacle to divine contemplation, and to the ascent of the soul towards the Father of spirits. In all their excursions, they were followed by women with whom they lived on terms of the closest familiarity. Those of them who conceived they had made the greatest proficiency in the higher spiritual life dispensed with the use of clothes altogether in their assemblies, looking upon decency and modesty as marks of inward corruption, characteristics of a soul that still grovelled under the dominion of the flesh, and had not yet been elevated into communion with the divine spirit, its centre and source. Sometimes their progress towards this mystic communion was accelerated by the Inquisition, and they expired in the flames, not merely with unclouded serenity, but with the most triumphant feelings of cheerfulness and joy. About the year 1830, there appeared in one of the states of the American Union, bordering on Kentucky, an impostor who declared that he was the Son of God, the Savior of mankind, and that he had reappeared on earth to recall the impious, the unbelieving, and sinners to their duty. He protested that if they did not mend their ways within a certain time, he would give the signal, and in a moment the world would crumble to ruins. These extravagant pretensions were received with favour even by persons of wealth and position in society. At last a German humbly besought the new Messiah to announce the dreadful catastrophe to his fellow countrymen in the German language, as they did not understand English, and it seemed a pity that they should be damned merely on that account. The would-be Saviour, in reply, confessed with great candour that he did not know German. "What?" retorted the German. "You, the Son of God, and don't speak all languages, and don't even know German? Come, come, you are a knave, a hypocrite, and a madman. Bedlam is the place for you." The spectators laughed, and went away ashamed of their credulity. Sometimes, at the death of the human incarnation, the divine spirit transmigrates into another man. The Buddhist Tartars believe in a great number of living Buddhas, who officiate as Grand Lamas at the head of the most important monasteries. When one of these Grand Lamas dies, his disciples do not sorrow, for they know that he will soon reappear, being born in the form of an infant. Their only anxiety is to discover the place of his birth. If at this time they see a rainbow, they take it as a sign sent them by the departed Lama to guide them to his cradle. Sometimes the divine infant himself reveals his identity. "I am the Grand Lama," he says, "the living Buddha of such and such a temple. Take me to my old monastery. I am its immortal head." In whatever way the birthplace of the Buddha is revealed, whether by the Buddha's own avowal or by the sign of the sky, tents are struck, and the joyful pilgrims, often headed by the king or one of the most illustrious of the royal family, set forth to find and bring home the infant God. Generally, he is born in Tibet, the Holy Land, and to reach him the caravan has often to traverse the most frightful deserts. When at last they find the child, they fall down and worship him. Before, however, he is acknowledged as the Grand Lama, he must satisfy them of his identity. He is asked the name of the monastery of which he claims to be the head, how far off it is, and how many monks live in it. He must also describe the habits of the deceased Grand Lama and the manner of his death. Then various articles as prayer books, teapots, and cups are placed before him, and he has to point out those used by himself in his previous life. If he does so without a mistake, his claims are admitted, and he is conducted in triumph to the monastery. At the head of all the lamas is the Dalai Lama of Lhasa, the Rome of Tibet. He is regarded as a living god, and at death his divine and immortal spirit is born again in a child. According to some accounts, the mode of discovering the Dalai Lama is similar to the method already described of discovering an ordinary Grand Lama. Other accounts speak of an election by drawing lots from a golden jar. Wherever he is born, the trees and plants put forth green leaves. At his bidding, flowers bloom, and springs of water rise, and his presence diffuses heavenly blessings. But he is by no means the only man who poses as a god in these regions. A register of all the incarnate gods in the Chinese Empire is kept in the Li Fan Yuan, or colonial office at Peking. The number of gods who have thus taken out a license is 160. Tibet is blessed with 30 of them. Northern Mongolia rejoices in 19, and southern Mongolia basks in the sunshine of no less than 57. The Chinese government, with a paternal solicitude for the welfare of its subjects, forbids the gods on the register to be reborn anywhere but in Tibet. They fear lest the birth of a god in Mongolia should have serious political consequences by stirring the dormant patriotism and warlike spirit of the Mongols, who might rally round an ambitious native deity of royal lineage, and seek to win for him, at the point of the sword, a temporal as well as a spiritual kingdom. But besides these public or licensed gods, there are a great many little private gods, or unlicensed practitioners of divinity, who work miracles and bless their people in holes and corners. And of late years the Chinese government has winked at the rebirth of these pettifogging deities outside of Tibet. However, once they are born, the government keeps its eye on them as well as on the regular practitioners, and if any of them misbehaves, he is promptly degraded, banished to a distant monastery, and strictly forbidden ever to be born again in the flesh. From our survey of the religious position occupied by the king in rude societies, we may infer that the claim to divine and supernatural powers put forward by the monarchs of great historical empires like those of Egypt, Mexico, and Peru was not the simple outcome of inflated vanity or the empty expressions of a groveling adulation. It was merely a survival and extension of the old savage apotheosis of living kings. Thus, for example, as children of the sun, the Incas of Peru were revered like gods. They could do no wrong, and no one dreamed of offending against the person, honor, or property of the monarch or of any of the royal race. Hence, too, the Incas did not, like most people, look on sickness as an evil. They considered it a messenger, sent from their father the sun, to call them to come and rest with them in heaven. Therefore, the usual words in which an Inca announced his approaching end were these: "My father calls me to come and rest with him." They would not oppose their father's will by offering sacrifice for recovery, but openly declared that he had called them to his rest. Issuing from the sultry valleys upon the lofty tableland of the Colombian Andes, the Spanish conquerors were astonished to find, in contrast to the savage hordes they had left in the sweltering jungles below, a people enjoying a fair degree of civilization, practicing agriculture, and living under a government which Humboldt has compared to the theocracies of Tibet and Japan. These were the Chibcas, Muiscas, or Mozics, divided into two kingdoms with capitals at Bogota and Tunia, but united apparently in spiritual allegiance to the high pontiff of Sogamozo, or Araka. By a long and ascetic novitiate, this ghostly ruler was reputed to have acquired such sanctity that the waters and the rain obeyed him, and the weather depended on his will. The Mexican kings, at their ascension, as we have seen, took an oath that they would make the sun to shine, the clouds to give rain, the rivers to flow, and the earth to bring forth fruits in abundance. We are told that Montezuma, the last king of Mexico, was worshipped by his people as a god. The early Babylonian kings, from the time of Sargon I till the 4th dynasty of Ur, or later, claimed to be gods in their lifetime. The monarchs of the 4th dynasty of Ur, in particular, had temples built in their honor. They set up their statues in various sanctuaries and commanded the people to sacrifice to them. The 8th month was especially dedicated to the kings, and sacrifices were offered to them at the new moon, and on the 15th of each month. Again, the Parthian monarchs of the Aracid house styled themselves brothers of the sun and moon, and were worshipped as deities. It was esteemed sacrilege to strike even a private member of the Arsacid family in a brawl. The kings of Egypt were deified in their lifetime. Sacrifices were offered to them, and their worship was celebrated in special temples and by special priests. Indeed, the worship of the kings sometimes casts that of the gods into the shade. Thus, in the reign of Merenra, a high official declared that he had built many holy places in order that the spirits of the king, the ever-living Merenra, might be invoked more than all the gods. It has never been doubted that the king claimed actual divinity. He was the great god, the golden Horus, the son of Ra. He claimed authority not only over Egypt, but over all lands and nations, the whole world in its length and its breadth, the east and the west, the entire compass of the great circuit of the sun, the sky and what is in it, the earth and all that is upon it. Every creature that walks upon 2 or upon 4 legs, all that fly or flutter, the whole world offers her productions to him. Whatever in fact might be asserted of the sun god was dogmatically predictable of the king of Egypt. His titles were directly derived from the sun god. In the course of his existence, we are told, the king of Egypt exhausted all the possible conceptions of divinity which the Egyptians had framed for themselves. A superhuman god by his birth and his royal office, he became the deified man after his death. Thus all that was known of the divine was summed up in him. We have now completed our sketch, for it is no more than a sketch of the evolution of that sacred kingship, which attained its highest form, its most absolute expression in the monarchies of Peru and Egypt. Historically, the institution appears to have originated in the order of public magicians or medicine men. Logically, it rests on a mistaken deduction from the association of ideas. Men mistook the order of their ideas for the order of nature, and hence imagined that the control which they have, or seem to have, over their thoughts, permitted them to exercise a corresponding control over things. The men, who for one reason or another, because of the strength or the weakness of their natural parts, were supposed to possess these magical powers in the highest degree, were gradually marked off from their fellows and became a separate class, who were destined to exercise a most far-reaching influence on the political, religious, and intellectual evolution of mankind. Social progress, as we know, consists mainly in a successive differentiation of functions, or, in simpler language, a division of labor. The work, which in primitive society is done by all alike and by all equally ill, or nearly so, is gradually distributed among different classes of workers and executed more and more perfectly. And so far as the products, material or immaterial, of this specialized labor are shared by all, the whole community benefits by the increasing specialization. Now magicians or medicine men appear to constitute the oldest artificial or professional class in the evolution of society. For sorcerers are found in every savage tribe known to us, and among the lowest savages, such as in the Australian Aborigines, they are the only professional class that exists. As time goes on, and the process of differentiation continues, the order of medicine men is itself subdivided into such classes as the healers of disease, the makers of rain, and so forth. While the most powerful members of the order wins for himself a position as chief and gradually develops into a sacred king, his old magical functions falling more and more into the background and being exchanged for priestly or even divine duties in proportion as magic is slowly ousted by religion. Still later, a partition is effected between the civil and the religious aspect of the kingship, the temporal power being committed to one man and the spiritual to another. Meanwhile, the magicians, who may be repressed but cannot be extirpated by the predominance of religion, still addict themselves to their old occult arts in preference to the newer ritual of sacrifice and prayer, and in time the more sagacious of their number perceive the fallacy of magic and hit upon a more effectual mode of manipulating the forces of nature for the good of man. In short, they abandon sorcery for science. I am far more affirming that the course of development has everywhere rigidly followed these lines. It has doubtless varied greatly in different societies. I merely mean to indicate, in the broadest outline, what I conceive to have been its general trend. Regarded from the industrial point of view, the evolution has been from uniformity to diversity of function. Regarded from the political point of view, it has been from democracy to despotism. With the later history of monarchy, especially with the decay of despotism and its displacement by forms of government better adapted to the higher needs of humanity, we are not concerned in this enquiry. Our theme is the growth, not the decay, of a great and, in its time, beneficent institution. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Covencast. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Covencast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovencast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.